So obviously a lot to go over in half an hour, but we'll give it a shot. So I'm Brian. This is actually my first conference talk. So I mostly do web app pen test work and just general pen test work at a tiny company called Accenture with 400,000 employees. So in terms of motivation, so most introductory resources about like application security kind of go over kind of more old school applications that in terms of presentation logic, business logic, most of that is happening on the server side. Maybe there's a little bit of jQuery thrown in there, but it's pretty much all going on the server side. So I wanted to do some more introductory material, but related to modern applications. So by modern, I mean stuff that's using a front-end framework, kind of like AngularJS, or just plain Angular, because there's a version difference there, Vue or React, and then it does a lot of the business logic and presentation logic on the client side using those. And then in terms of a little more of the business logic happens on the server side, communicating via an API, usually RESTful. Sometimes in like really bleeding edge, they might use something like GraphQL. Want to note, this is going to be mostly based on my own experience. So as some of you probably know if you're familiar, like for example, React is probably one of the most important frameworks in this. I'm not going to go over that a whole lot, and that's not because it's not important. It's just because that's not where my testing experience lies. So first I want to go over XSS in front-end frameworks. So one of the things you have in these frameworks is the concept of data binding and client-side templates. So in kind of an older, very jQuery heavy app, the kind of thing you might see is manual DOM traversal using CSS selectors, things like that, to grab elements out of the DOM, manually replace their HTML. In these kind of frameworks, you can actually go in and put things like, here we got this message variable in the data model, and then for instance we can bind this input field to that message in the data model, and then it'll be dynamically updated at runtime. So as I add or remove from here, it'll get updated. So that's a lot cleaner. So these expressions are actually protected against XSS by default. They go ahead and encode your common XSS characters client side. So this protects you against your usual DOM-based XSS that you might see with those. There's kind of two ways then that we might look at getting XSS anyway. Why do I keep looking back there? So the first one, most obvious, is, okay, so it has these protections. All of these frameworks have some way to disable those protections if the developer so desires. If you disable that protection, someone can get DOM-based XSS for that. That's not really that interesting. The kind of more interesting thing, and the thing that might be new to some of you, you might have seen it in like a burp scanner report as client-side template injection, but not really known what it is these expressions I showed before. You know, I just have that variable message, but they can get a little more complicated. So you got some fancier like single-page applications, which are very, very much like all client-side stuff, but a lot of applications, especially if it's an older one that's kind of been given an update, will mix server-side and client-side presentation logic. So if there's some kind of point in the page where, you know, with the PHP echo or JSP or, you know, time leaf template or something like that, that we could inject our own expression in there, potentially we could do something dangerous. So one thing to bear in mind as we talk about this is that a server-side templating engine to protect against XSS is going to look at encoding angle brackets, quotation marks usually. So we just saw, though, these expressions are demarcated by curly braces. So AngularJS expressions are more powerful than what we just saw, but they're not as powerful as just plain JavaScript. They're kind of JavaScript-esque. They run in the browser's JavaScript interpreter, but before that, they get run through a parser by AngularJS. And so you can do simple operations, access object properties, but you can't access like important globals like window or document. And so, like for example, alert, you want to pop an alert box. Alert is actually window.alert or document.cookie, obviously that's on document. So you can't just do like a straightforward XSS attack like this. One thing to note real quick is that the technique I'm going to go over here, versions of AngularJS before 1.6 had a sandbox to prevent these, but it didn't really work. Researchers found a whole bunch of ways to get around it. They removed it since it didn't work, but if you find an older version of AngularJS, just go on like the Portswigger website, look up an escape, and you'll be fine. So starting out, what we're talking about is, for example, we've got like PHP echo get foo. So what we might as an attacker provide is this expression, and this will pop an alert box for us. And so if we want to break that down, so what we're starting out with is we just got an empty object, and then if we do add toString to that, now that's a function. We haven't called that. And then if we do constructor, then we get the function constructor, and that's not just the constructor for toString, it's the constructor just for functions in general in JavaScript. And so JavaScript's function constructor, we can pass raw JavaScript to it and dynamically create new functions at runtime. So then if we call that by adding those parentheses, then we'll pop our alert box. So same thing exactly, verbatim, works in Vue. And this technique right here is actually from the source code of AngularJS, where they say, hey, you could do this. So the next thing, so I mentioned that, so we're not doing angle brackets, so that'll get us around those filters and encoding. But what about quotation marks? So we use single quotes to surround our string there. So there's a couple things that come to mind first. One thing that came to mind when I was looking at this one time was, okay, maybe I'll use backticks. If you're not aware, there's a new ECMAScript standard called template literals that are denoted by backticks and create strings that way. But like I said, AngularJS expressions are not really JavaScript. They're run through a parser first, and that parser doesn't parse this, so that doesn't work. Can't do just straight string.fromCharCode because just like the window global and the document global, you can't just grab that willy-nilly. So okay, what we saw before, our kind of object.toString.constructor thing. So maybe we can launch off of that to get a string. So that by itself is not going to work either, because like I said, this constructor we got here is the function constructor for all functions, not the string constructor. So if we call from charcode on there, that's not going to work. So a quick disclaimer. There's a simpler way to do this than what I'm going to present. When I was first making the presentation, I tried the simple way, it didn't work. When I was practicing it, I tried it and it did work. But this way is kind of interesting, and you might learn some things from it, so I think it's kind of cool. Quiz question, does anyone know who that is? Nope, no book for you. So the JavaScript's an interesting language, and it's got all these weird automatic type conversions, some less weird than others. The one that's like really weird to me, maybe I'm just don't know enough, is if in an expression you give an exclamation point and empty square braces, that will evaluate to the Boolean value false. I don't know. Empty braces, of course, that's just an empty array. Plus, that's concatenation or arithmetic. So if you add these together with the plus operator, what you'll end up getting is the string false. So now, and if you're interested in this kind of weird stuff, because I am, this book, Web Application Obfuscation, is really good. Also, these guys, Mario Heiderich and Gareth Hayes, they've got a lot of cool stuff on the internet. So we break that down now. So we've got a string and don't have any quotes. So now if we do constructor, we can get from char code and then run that, and we can put in our stuff. And so the whole purpose of that is now we can do XSS and this time evade pretty much any server-side XSS filter that you would normally see. And also a lot of WAFs and even like XSS Auditor in Chrome. So that's pretty cool. So like I said, there's actually a simpler way to do that. So before I said, okay, object.toString, that's just a function. Well, if we just do object.toString and then call that function, that's an empty string. So this works too. It's simpler. In my opinion, not as cool. Another question. So here we got this SHA-256 hash attribute in our script, and I've used that before. This is part of a new security standard for web pages. Does anyone know what that's called? You guys, come on. It's called sub-resource integrity. You should read about it. It's actually pretty cool. Does anyone know who this is or what he's from? Man. Corporate politics. So enumeration, obviously, that's one of our more important things to do as pen testers. And there's some kind of unique opportunities that we'll get in some of these applications that we might not get in a normal like old one. Quickly, just as a point of reference, so for our kind of general architecture we're talking about here, we've got a front end running the browser, and that handles the presentation logic, at least most of it, and also a lot of the business logic. Could be running framework like one of these. Easy or quiz question, what company made Angular? Okay, too many people said that. I don't know. Okay. Okay, someone raised their hand for what company made React. Okay, he predicted the future. So, what is it? That guy? Oh, sorry. That guy's the side up first. Yeah. So come get this. So, first thing, I don't care what, just get whatever. So first thing we want to look at in terms of enumeration, kind of easier said than done, but when a developer is putting together an application in Vue or AngularJS, whatever, they're going to develop a whole bunch of modules. They're going to be different files, everything. But then they're going to run them through this abomination called Webpack. And it's all going to get mushed together in one single mangled, minified file. And so there's a good chance that the functionality for different roles is going to be in there. So potentially as an unprivileged user or even maybe an unauthenticated user, you could see the client-side business logic for admin roles, for example. So if you go and look around there and you look for XHR calls, or in this random example, they've got their own little wrapper there. You might be able to find, you might be able to find sensitive REST API calls that you want to test, see if there's any authorization issues. So another thing, of course, so more on the server end of things, we're dealing with REST APIs. The application we're looking at in terms of the front end business logic might not actually be covering all of the possible API functionality. So if we can get the API documentation, especially in a machine-readable format like OpenAPI, Swagger, or Waddle, that'll really help us to map out the API. If we're doing like a white box or gray box kind of assessment, we can just like ask the developers for it. But a lot of different REST frameworks actually auto-generate it. So you can first just try just kind of typical paths where you might see it is. And then depending on the framework, there might be other places. So it's not necessarily default, but for example, for Jersey, I see this application.waddle a lot. And so you can see as an example here, as a random example from the internet of a .waddle file that you can see has different resources and parameters and all that stuff. And that's going to help you out find maybe even functionality that's not even used by the application as is. And so they didn't even really think much about the security behind it. So next for logic and authorization testing. So quick kind of basic rundown of REST if you're not familiar. So REST, there's kind of conventions and maybe things you should do versus what people ever actually do. But conventionally, what you'll do is say I've got an app that handles books. So if I want to get a list of all the books, do get/API/books. Want to create a book, do a post to that same URL. Want to retrieve a book, okay, I've got an ID for that, do a get, edit, same URL, but with a put or more rarely a patch. And these are just HTTP request methods. If I want to delete a book, I just use the delete request method. So the reason I go over that is because of these two reasons. Well, three. So the first and foremost, as some of you already probably keyed in on, is because so much of the business logic is actually done on the client side. Of course, we all know client-side business logic, there could be security issues there. Things maybe we can bypass. So, and to give you an idea of how extensive business logic is in terms of how much is put on the server side, put on the client side in terms of presentation business logic, you'll very frequently see, even just for something as simple as putting your username in the right-hand corner, they'll actually do like get/users/current. So that's a common place where you'd have mistakes. Just in terms of general, okay, bypassing client-side business logic. Another thing is just in my experience, at least. So REST, as we kind of saw before with the books, kind of encourages you to think of what you're doing in terms of like the resources, underlying resources. The users, the books, the roles, not necessarily like an action. So you're doing oftentimes a put against a user's resource, not specifically calling some like struts action that is meant specifically to change user emails, things like that. And at least what I've found is because of that kind of change in mindset, people are a little more prone to forget to add necessary authorization checks that they might normally be second nature to them. So in terms of a couple real-world examples of this, hopefully clear that up a bit. So in one case, I was looking at an application. Like I said, just to get my basic user information to display, called get/users/current. And I said, going back to convention, said, okay, there's a good chance that that the way it modifies this is not through some explicit action, but just through a put or patch request to that URL. So lo and behold, it took some trial and error getting exactly the right thing, but all I had to do was issue a put request to that with an admin as my role, and I became an admin. Similarly, kind of same situation. Thank you. Kind of same situation. Looking at is saw the get user/current and just did a post. Made up a post, didn't necessarily know that it was there, just guessed maybe could be there, and created new admin users. Similar type of things. This is more of a basic IDOR, but just in a REST API. Did a get to another, did a get to other users and was able to get their password reset questions out of their profiles. Another one was did a patch request to other users and could reset their password reset pins. And so what I mean in terms of the conventions here is normally when you're trying to privest through an application, unless you're explicitly given, you know, again in more of a white box, gray box situation, explicitly given admin credentials so you can compare, you know, what you see as a normal user, what you see in as admin, and you see, oh, here's change user role.php. You don't even necessarily know what you would even try to do to check if there are any authorization on those types of things. But here, because they use pretty standard conventions in many cases, you can just guess, oh, let me try put, and that might just work. Same thing in terms of the fact that you may be able to just look in the client-side source and find those REST API calls when in an older application, those might never be revealed to you. So quickly, actually going down in details on this is kind of a lightning talk unto itself. But if you ever find yourself, as I've done before, manually writing a whole bunch of REST API requests in burp repeater or in curl, do yourself a favor and download Postman, which is a graphical API client for REST APIs. It can import API documentation like those Waddle and Swagger files I mentioned. And it also has these features called environments and collections that, if you go look them up, those can be really helpful for easily switching between different roles in the application and different sample data to very quickly do manual authorization testing compared to if you were going to tediously go around with burp or curl or whatever and keep switching around your token. So kind of some miscellaneous things. So cores or, oh, I don't define it in here, so someone can question, someone raise their hand. What does cores stand for? You. Yeah. So hopefully a lot of you are already familiar with this, but to understand cross-origin resource sharing, you need to have a little bit of understanding of same origin policy and what it's protecting against. So as you know, you can do AJAX requests with the XML HTTP request object in JavaScript. You can do a request, get the response to it, read that. If you set the with credentials to that, you can actually use cookies, auth headers, client certificates, things like that. So what stops attacker.com from doing, you know, gmail.com/API/inbox, and if I'm logged in, just stealing all my emails? Well, what stops it is the origin policy. If you try to do that, your browser will compare your origin, which is compare your origin to Gmail's origin and decide they're not the same, hence same origin policy, and forbid you from reading that response. Quickly, origin is scheme, hostname, and port, so like HTTPS, gmail.com, 443. So sometimes you may need to, as a developer, explicitly get around that policy for your legitimate functionality in the application. So developers, thank you. So developers, like I said, can override that functionality with something called CORS, cross-origin resource sharing. Bit more involved than this, but say Brian.com made an example, made an AJAX call to Hysell.com. Hysell.com could then turn around and give two headers. One, access control allow origin, HTTPS, Brian.com. Note the HTTPS is in there because it's on origins, not just host names, and scheme is part of the origin. The port is implicit. And also access control allow credentials to true, which would allow the calling JavaScript to use that with credentials property. And so then in that case, the browser would send that request. In most cases, it would send the request either way, which is a CSRF issue. But then it would allow Brian.com to actually read that response. So CORS pitfalls, or at least, I guess, a pitfall. So you may have seen, again, in the burp scan, but maybe not quite understood it, this thing called CrossOrigin resource sharing, arbitrary origin accepted. So what is that? So when your browser is making this request with AJAX, or a lot of other requests, it sends a header called origin. And so you got your AJAX request on attacker.com, sends origin, HTTPS attacker.com. There's a surprising number of misconfigured applications that will just take that origin header and reflect it straight back into access control allow origin. And at the same time, they may also set access control allow credentials to true. If that's the case, and not that this would happen, but if Google did have that issue, then we could just get everything from the inbox with our page. If you're kind of wondering why this is, because it is a little odd. Actually, it's going to take too long to explain. Point is, it happens sometimes, and it's insecure. So test for it. Quickly, I don't know how modern this is. Just a very kind of basic thing. So people are not generally just handwriting all of their REST code. They're using some kind of REST framework, especially when they're in like the Java world. A lot of those have various vulnerabilities, sometimes pretty bad ones. Another quiz question, hopefully someone will know. So there's a struts REST API, struts REST RCE issue year and a half-ish ago. This was due to it passing untrusted XML to a certain Java library. Does anyone know what that library was? It's one called Xstream. It basically turns XML into arbitrary Java objects, and it because of that, you can get basically a Java deserialization attack. So point of this is check your REST frameworks for vulnerabilities. This presentation in particular, unsafe JAX-RS, breaking REST APIs, and these two are pretty good. I'll leave that up. The last thing, 1 minute. We got 1 minute for Q&A. Actually, last prize. Name a non-main character from Aqua Teen Hunger Force. Not one of the 4 main characters. Yep. Any 30-second question? I'll post them on my Twitter, which is in the guide, and also it's just @Brian Hysell. It's just my name.
Hi, Alice.